morning, everyone. I'm Archana, a research analyst at the Institute of South Asian Studies. Thank you for joining the panel discussion on the post-election US policy towards the Indo-Pacific, expectations and concerns. This panel is jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Japan. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate if you could mute your microphones throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via the Zoom chat. The questions will be consolidated for the panelists to address. Now, we are delighted to have the following distinguished panelists today: Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan, Distinguished Fellow and the head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative, Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi; Mr. Tsuneo Watanabe, Senior Fellow, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Japan; Mr. Drew Thompson, Visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore; and Ms. Junko Chano, Executive Director, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Japan, will deliver the closing remarks towards the end of the session. The panel discussion will be chaired by Professor C. Mohan, the Director of ISAS. I now invite Professor Mohan to chair the discussion, please.
Thank you, Archana, and let me join you in welcoming the large audience we have this morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning with us. I'm from Singapore, and we have a large audience from Japan and some from the South Asian and other regions of the world. Let me begin by saying what a special privilege is for ISAS to host this event jointly with the Sasakawa Foundation in Tokyo. This is our first collaboration, and we hope that this is the beginning of a long-term, productive and consequential partnership on issues of interest to the foundation as well as the institute here in Singapore. We see this event today as one of three series of three events in the weeks ahead, and that will be the beginning of a longer-term engagement between the two of us. So thank you, Chano-san, for initiating and building this partnership with ISAS. Today's subject, of course, is quite topical. I mean, for months, we've not heard anything but about the US elections. As we know, the US elections is a spectacle. It lasts almost now these days 1.5 years. And there's a racing metaphor of horses running and the continuous betting on who might win. But I think given the importance of the US and the impact of what happens in the US on everyone else in the world, it's only natural that the whole world takes interest in the US process, its outcomes, and now there is a huge speculation about where the Biden administration might take the US and how it deal with the rest of the world. During the campaign, Trump called it the most important election in the US ever. Biden called it the battle for the soul of America. We must always discount what the politicians say because hyperbole comes naturally to them. But the fact is that the US is as a cusp. And I think what happens now, I mean, we've seen last 4 years where Trump introduced a number of disruptions into the way the US deals with the world. And Biden will have a challenge now of whether he discards it, or whether he modifies it, whether he adapts to the new dynamic that Trump had unleashed. To simplify, I mean, I think what Trump did in the last many years was really to challenge the essence of post-war American internationalism. He questioned economic globalization. He trashed the US alliances as unsustainable. He's closed America's borders. So therefore, the idea that, look, America is for free trade, America is for alliances, and America's borders are open, all three were sacred assumptions that he's broken through. So where does this go? And is one of the themes. And I think we have Drew Thompson, who's worked in the US government. I'm sure people are going to ask him, and he's going to say interesting things. Then there's a question of how the region sees it. We have colleagues from Delhi and Tokyo who will look at how the region might deal with, expect from President-elect Biden. Now here, I think if you look at, while his general propositions were contested everywhere, kind of produced shock and awe in Asia, there has been at least some recognition that Trump has consolidated the thinking over the last two administrations on Asia and institutionalized a concrete strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, consolidating the structure as well as making that the new geography is now an accepted term around the world. So on the question of China, which is really much of the policies of Trump are really about China, there's been this talk about comprehensive confrontation in the last few weeks, last few months of the Trump era. There is talk about total decoupling of the two economies. We've seen a trade war. The reaction to this, I think, in the region has varied. I mean, on the one hand, there are groups of people who would want to go back to business as usual, that Trump is an exception, was an aberration, and that they would love to see a US-China reset and a return to globalization. Then there are others who see a Biden bringing back all the people from Obama period, and they would go back to a policy of putting China first in its Asia and the Indo-Pacific policy. So that generates fears about abandonment and that a violent turn once again on the Asia policy in favor of engagement, collaboration with China, I think is already produced some concerns in India, in Taiwan, in Australia, in Japan. There is a debate how exactly, what does this mean for us going forward? Then there are those in Southeast Asia and many other parts of the world who fear entrapment, that a continuation of the current policies would push them into getting caught in the confrontation between the US and China. Also, most of them say, look, we don't want to make choices, just leave us alone. Just do what we are doing before, because for 4 decades, US and China were integrating, were collaborating, were partners. Today, the stress on that relationship is the principal variable in the Indo-Pacific. How the Indo-Pacific region plays out largely depends on the nature of the relationship between US and China. And we saw one particular methodology, one particular framework under Trump. And the question now is, what will Biden do with it? So I will stop here and welcome you all again. And once again, express my thanks to the Sasakawa Foundation for joining us in this important debate. So I'll start by asking Dr. Rajagopalan from Delhi, the ORF. All speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. We will then go into a short conversation within the panel, and then we'll come back to the come to the audience and close with remarks from Chano-san. So Raji, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to ISAS and Professor Rajamohan for having me as part of this conversation. So clearly, Dr. Rajamohan has said, as we are looking at a post-Trump era in US politics, some of the key phrases and describing it are like reliability, predictability, level-headedness. There is a consistent and coherent approach, and so on and so forth. But I think Trump's unpredictable nature had its own pluses in the region. China, for instance, was never sure how the US might respond to some of the excessive muscular behavior. At least that was the case in the first few years. Can't say the same for the China's behavior in 2020, for instance. Nevertheless, I think we are looking at a new America. There will be a lot of continuity, but there could be some changes in style and rhetoric as well as in substantial terms. So let me try and address 3 points in here. First, take a look at, of course, China. China has been and will continue to be at the center of the Indo-Pacific policy debates. A lot has changed over the last 4 years. There appears to be a bipartisan consensus on China. There is a growing sense that there is a need to address China as a threat, and the time to confront China is now. But there also appears to be certain disagreements within the Democrats, for instance, among the Democrats on how to handle China. Everyone agrees that China is the problem, but how to address, I think there are variations in that. There are some serious disagreements on that. There are some who believe that you need to work with China to address some of the global issues, for instance, like climate change. So I think that perspective is also, especially within the Democrats, is also coming to play. So there are this sharp divisions and disagreements within the Democrats in how they need to go about handling China. But we also know that there are some larger differences between the left wing of the Democratic, the more radical ones, and the progressive. So it is possible that you will see this disagreement play out even on the China policy also. Even though Biden has come out saying, especially in his essay in the Foreign Affairs, saying that the US will get tough on China, he has talked about swift economic sanctions if China tries to threaten the American citizens and companies. But I think Biden is going to be in a fix in terms of how to find a midway in handling China. I think the difficulties along the lines, for instance, Michelle Flournoy's possible nomination to be defense secretary, I think these are all seeing the reflections of the kind of difficulties within the Democrats on the one hand, but again, finding some sort of a midway between the Democrats and the Republicans again is going to be a problem. There is also a domestic problem, which is what, even though the Democrats, the Biden, Kamala Harris, they have won the presidency, they lost a large number of House seats, lost a large number of counties, Midwest in particular. So there is a market for a tougher trade policy on China. So he has to be able to, the administration has to be able to address that particular constituency, that particular market also has to be looked into in a very serious fashion by the Biden administration. And of course, on the security side, certainly the number of issues that have come up, China's aggressive behavior towards all its neighbors and those away from its neighbors, away from the immediate neighborhood, whether it is Canada, Sweden, none of these countries have been spared. So even from a security perspective, I think there are calls for a tougher action on China. So overall, when you look at it, this would, in a sense, translate to continuing rivalry between US and China, whether it is on trade and economy issues, technology. Tech has become, again, has come to be at the center of the politics between and the competition between US and China, and of course the security. So these are going to continue sort of playing out in the US-China context. And I think this is something that the region will also be waiting to see how, because much of the region has preferred not to take a stand between US and China. But I think increasingly, especially the events or the incidents over the last 1 year, has actually pushed many countries to take a clearer stand in a sense. So I think this would also mean the continuing momentum in the US relations with like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific. So there is that overall perception that China is a competitor than a partner, and that is here to stay. So the turn against China is likely to stay, and it's possibly bipartisan. But I think there are going to be a certain amount of difficulties and disagreements within the Democrats itself, and I think that's going to come out time and again in a sense. There is also one more concern about, there could be a lot of concern on their comfort areas, like there could be a huge focus back on Europe and Russia. But I think the world is very different today from 4 years from the time Biden was the vice president. I think the world has changed a lot, especially the Indo-Pacific region. China has changed a lot. So I think there could be that a new focus on Asia, on the Indo-Pacific and China. But I think that comfort zone, well, to deal with the comfort zone, Europe and Russia cannot be ruled out as well. Coming to the second point on the Indo-Pacific, I think, again, no one perspective in the region, across the region, for instance, but I think the region, when you look at the kind of perspective on the Biden administration, the countries that have been at the receiving end of China's aggressive behavior, those countries are going to be the most concerned about the Biden administration, like the chair said, because they would like to see how the new administration will deal with China. Will it be a continuation of Trump's direct confrontation approach, or will it return to an Obama-style diplomacy, and which was, in a sense, somewhat seen as conciliatory in nature, at least many in the region perceived so. So it's going to be a lot of the countries, whether it is Vietnam, Philippines, depending on who it's going to be in the country, in the president of the country. In 2 years' time, you have the elections coming up and so on and so forth. But I think many countries in the region are waiting to see how he will handle the China factor, and I think that's going to determine. But the region also has had problems with Trump. It's not to say that everybody has been happy entirely with the Trump administration. So in that sense, ASEAN also wants greater consideration of their views. I think that's other aspect about how they want their views to be seen. Trump really did not care for the views across the region, views from the region in a sense. And to that extent, I think there was some disappointment, but I think they were happy with the fact that he was able to handle the China front, the China threat in a much more direct fashion. But I think given the some sort of uncertainty about the U.S. role that might play in the region has developed a number of different coalitions, whether it is in terms of strengthening bilateral relations, a number of trilaterals that have come up, and multilaterals that are taking shape, and that's precisely because of the uncertainty around the U.S. in a sense. So Biden. How is he going to play this card? How is he likely to Biden likely to pay greater attention to the US allies, but the US was away for 4 years, and the other countries in the region have formed their own coalitions, whether it is India, Australia, strengthening of some of the bilateral relations, India, Australia, India, Japan, Australia, Japan, India, Vietnam. A number of this bilateral as well as trilateral relations have become very, very strong, and that is possibly because of the US and sort of uncertainty factor. So how the US alliance system will fit these new minilaterals taking shape in the region, I think that's something that needs to be seen. Can Biden change the domestic growing opposition to the US engagements across different regions? And I think that's an important question to look at. So I think that's another way to kind of look at the whole Indo-Pacific security and strategic dynamics. One related factor is the whole Taiwan factor, because I think Taiwan had assumed quite a bit of prominence under the Trump administration. You did see strengthened interactions between the US and Taiwan, like we have not seen in recent decades. Trump administration significantly increased the weapons sales, stepped up the economic cooperation, several high-level political visits, and so on and so forth. In many ways, I think the Biden administration will be forced to follow this outreach and proactivism when it comes to Taiwan, or otherwise he will be there is a risk of being called out for being soft on China. But it's still unclear at this stage how it'll play out, as Biden is likely to follow a similar approach towards Taiwan with possibly less sound and light show, but I think it's going to be a tough call on the Biden administration to see how this. Reportedly, I think the Biden transition team has already reached out to Taiwan. But for instance, when President Tsai Ing-wen sent a congratulatory message, Biden did not even respond to that. So there are, there are mixed messages in how he would possibly respond to or sort of a look at this Taiwan aspect as well. Coming to the last point on the US-India relations, I think overall there is going to be that continuity in the positive the trends that we have seen in the last 4 years. But there are going to be less likely for photo opportunities and so on and so forth, unlike the Modi-Trump style. But I think substantively speaking, I think they are likely to continue with the positive momentum that have been generated so far. There could be some mixed picture, as in other regions. Some satisfaction, because I think the Trump was not particularly looking at India's domestic issues, so there was no particular criticism and so on and so forth. But if you are going to be looking at getting some sort of a fair amount of steadiness in the relationship, it is also going to come with certain amount of criticism on a number of India's domestic issues. So I think it's going to be a mixed baggage in some sense. So like everyone else, we are also looking at steadiness, but that steadiness is going to likely to come along with it a lot of criticism on domestic issues, and that's going to be a problem from an Indian perspective. Security and defense ties likely to continue without much glitches, because especially given that India and the US have completed the signing of the 4 foundational agreements. But even then, I think there is a mismatch in expectations when it comes to DTT, Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, for instance. From the Indian perspective, it is the technology transfer issue that is the more dominant aspect. From the US perspective, it is so there are certain mismatches, mismatch in terms of expectations. But I think there's largely likely to be the security-driven relations that are going to continue. one final point on the focus on democracy, which is Biden's plan for summit of democracies and so on and so forth. I would think that that is going to be somewhat limiting in one fashion, because I think it might be good to have a sort of a grouping of the like-minded countries, because how do you then bring in countries like Vietnam, for instance? So it has to be somewhat more an inclusive format that you look at, rather than a summit of the democracies could actually divide the region in some ways, I would think. But I think overall, I think there is the expectation that this is the Biden administration could bring in a more coherent and coordinated approach towards the region. So I'll stop here, and I think maybe overshot the time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rajesh. That was wonderful, and I think precise. You covered a lot of ground. So now we'll hear the Japanese perceptions from Tokyo from Watanabe-san. So the floor is yours for 10 minutes, and I think you have a PowerPoint.
Thank you very much. Now I'm trying to put my PowerPoint. All right. Appreciated the invitation and the leadership of ISAS and the Mohan-san. Thank you very much. It's good to see in such a COVID-19 moment to discuss. So, you know, Japan is a kind of a rare country, one of the few countries who didn't have a big trouble with the Trump administration. So I think one of the reasons is, of course, chemistry, Abe and Trump is good, but I appreciated this guy, General Mattis, as a Secretary of State, and DOD functioned very well compared to the other department of the US government. But you know, at the same time, Japan, I was shocked. The General Mattis criticized Mr. Trump. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who doesn't try to unite the American people, doesn't even pretend to try. So that's worry, division of the U.S. because Japan has been enjoyed bipartisan support of bilateral U.S.-Japan alliance, but U.S. is dividing. That's really bad. Why? I think you know, he made this comment after this. The Mr. Trump visited church by the just making the clear of the peaceful demonstration. I think this kind of things is really bad because I think another guy, we are happily working with the John Bolton as a national security advisor. His book clearly showed how closely Japan and the US, especially the Bolton and Abe or national security advisor Yachi was there, especially for the North Korean issue. What Trump does want to do, according to the Bolton's talk, every president takes politics into the count. However, count in politics. However, I cannot see this. Okay. Making their decision, national security, domestic policy, but difference with Trump is that politics of getting re-elected predominate over every other state. So no, he's an election first, not the national security first, the people first. That was a kind of trouble. So, you know, I personally foresaw 50-50 Trump the second or Biden world. So world with Trump would be accelerate the decline of US leadership, growing a division in the US. Either direction is possible, US-China new Cold War, or Trump-C deal. That's really bad for Japan and other allied countries. Continue to ignore advisor, Congress, allied, and the democratic value. Instead, the world with Biden now we are seeing, try to throw the decline of US leadership, but probably not so easy to. Growing division in the US continues, unfortunately. And the tough stance on China continues. But a room for cooperation in such a climate change, actually, the previous speaker talked. And respect experts' advice, Congress, allied, and democracy. That's a good thing, actually. I like it. And the tough on Russia and abuse of human rights. That's probably good thing. So if Trump continues, I think Xi Jinping and Putin like it, and maybe Xi Jinping like it, but reality is not. So world after COVID-19, according to Richard Haass. So he, according to his foreign affairs article, China's hegemony, maybe not. End of China's leadership, maybe not. End of globalization, maybe not. New age of global cooperation, maybe not. So decline of the US leadership, hollow international cooperation at global level, competitive relation of major powers. That's pessimistic, but maybe reality. I agree with him. So current situation maybe resembled with the end of the First World War. So at the time, the wariness, so inward-looking US. And but at the same time, people are violence because according to the World War I and learning the violence-leaning soldier who fought a war, and the two divided political group in the US, Wilsonian and American First Republican. So appeasement to fascism came, but some people are sympathy to fascism, even in the US, such as Charles Lindbergh. And US non-participation in the League of the Nations. So even League of the Nations was founded on the idea of President Wilson. US didn't participate. Of course, Congress didn't like it. So world after COVID-19 and the US election, America first change, and the Tea Party like a small government dogma change. I'm not so sure. Not so easy job for. Of course, I'm sure the Biden tried to change, but the U.S. new Cold War continue. That's my prediction. And the New Deal of the 21st century in the domestically very difficult because looking at the Democratic Party didn't win majority, as a previous speaker said. So Japan's idea is so far dependence on the US military presence and alliance with US. Yes, we need to continue without it. Very difficult to things. Dependence on the supply chain in China. Still, we are heavily depends on China and China recovered the economy. So we need to economic recovery. Yes, we need to. However, new idea. That's middle power cooperation with Australia, India, ASEAN, Canada, and Europe. Oh, I forgot to mention South Korea, potentially, hopefully. And strategic review of the supply chain. That's not equal to the decoupling of the Chinese economy. But you know, clearly US is a changing supply chain. And clearly as a like-minded country try to change because it's a big risk. But that doesn't mean we completely decouple the Chinese economy. That's direction. So the new administration in Biden is encouraging somehow. So Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, I think he wrote an article on the foreign affairs, and clearly he showed shared some idea. U.S. engagement policy to China in the past was clearly failed, and need a new idea. That's clearly more tough stance and respect allied partner. I think that's not so bad things for allied partner. Same thing applied to the Tony Blinken. He's also the sharing almost same idea. And hopefully Michel Flournoy has become the Secretary of Defense. I think, of course, Washington Post article recently carried the many speculation why the Biden didn't include the Michel. Maybe considering some left in Democratic Party. I think Biden's the very subtle and difficult management within the left wing of the Democratic Party, and also tough Republican in Congress. You know, that's necessary, by the way, for political coordination. I think Biden is good, according to his career in a long time in Congress. I'm not so worried about it. And Japan is somehow the Mr. Trump. Now I have 1 minute. Because some Japanese people are, if U.S. Biden is picking up a very old type, too much appeasement type to China, not so good. So people are afraid of Susan Rice going to be picked up for the Secretary of State. But in reality, I think Biden chose a more realistic and well-balanced with an allied partner. So that gives a very good relief to Japan. Also, Japan is the Japanese government, the Suga government knew climate change would be the big the issue for the Biden. Some conservative American critics say that Biden needed to pick up John Kerry for the climate change because he picked up many realists in the foreign security team. So the Biden really needed to some excuse to the left wing, especially the left wing part of the party. It conceded a lot and joined the Biden camp to defeat Biden and to defeat not Biden, to defeat Trump. So very understandable. Japan is adjusting, and climate change is also very important issue. So it's all right. So Biden, by the way, is an interesting person who visited Japan after tsunami in Sendai 2011. He gave a very good speech with his sympathy to the people who lost family and friends in tsunami. Of course, he did a very tough experience. So it's not so bad thing for the allied partner to work closely with Biden. By the way, when Prime Minister Abe was retired, interestingly, Trump and Biden both gave us, I'm missing the Prime Minister Abe. So I hope Japan to work closely with Biden as well as we've done with the Trump administration. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back visible. So now, thank you, Watanabe-san. Now we go to Drew Thompson, who is at the LKY School in Singapore, has worked in the US government. So Drew, we're going to put you on the spot. So you have to tell us more about the US and how things might pan out. The floor is yours. Yeah.
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you, Raja, for having me. And thank you also to Junko and our colleagues at Sasakawa for organizing this along with NUS. So I think the first thing to think about is that the Biden team has already stated that their top priorities are domestic, naming COVID, economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change as the top 4 priorities for the transition team when they hit the ground. So I think foreign policy clearly doesn't make the list, but unless a crisis forces that foreign policy onto his agenda, it's going to be somewhat in the background at the get-go. I mean, and I think I personally agree with that. I'd very much like to see the vaccine rollout go smoothly in 2021. So I think that's pretty rational. But I mean, foreign policy, unfortunately, is somewhat unavoidable. But the national security team that's being assembled, and I totally agree with Nabe, it's very competent, it's very experienced, and they have the right perspective, in my opinion. They're very aware of the criticisms of the Obama administration's foreign policy. They're quick to point out that they'll do things differently, but that they just haven't had a chance yet to really demonstrate that. Senator Marco Rubio very rudely described the Biden nominees as polite and orderly caretakers of America's decline. And I think that's a conservative realist jab at the liberal internationalists. So it resonates, but it's really too soon to be fair. The Biden team will unquestionably seek to restore a formal process to interagency decision-making. And I think that will be a very welcome change from the chaos and the inconsistencies of the Trump administration. But like any team, they're going to go through a cycle of forming, storming, and norming before they actually hit their stride. And there's very little doubt about the diversity of outlooks and perspectives in the administration, which includes foreign policy. So I don't think they self-identify as coming from particular groups, but their different perspectives about approaches and priorities are definitely being carefully dissected by analysts in Washington right now. So Thomas Wright from the Brookings Institution wrote in the Atlantic magazine not long ago what he described as an internal debate within the Biden team as one between two camps. He described them as restorationists and reformists. And Josh Rogan in the Washington Post overnight wrote an article citing a former John McCain staffer, Eric Sayers, and he divides them into three camps: competitors, centrists, and optimists. So I think the restorationist or the optimist camp is essentially the Obama 2.0. They're cautious, incremental, hopeful for bilateral cooperation with Beijing, and willing to accommodate China in order to hopefully get support. And whether that's support in international conferences, the optimists are going to also support free trade deals. They're probably also more likely to get entrapped in Middle East entanglements and other areas. They're also going to heavily focus on NATO and Russia, or whatever crisis of the day consumes everything, and whatever strategy is drafted ends up sitting on the shelf. And that's a very Washington phenomena. The reformists or the competitors recognize that US foreign policy needs to fundamentally change if it's going to deal with two things: the rise of China, but also to deal with the underlying forces of nationalist populism and anti-globalization that got Trump not only elected in 2016, but also still got him over 70 million votes in this election, despite everything that was wrong with the Trump administration, the divisions in society that he exacerbated that Nabe described. So the administration that's incoming needs to recognize the fact that American workers have not benefited from globalization, and international affairs are generally pretty insignificant compared to the daily challenges that the average American faces. So making that connection between international affairs and those daily travails and issues that hit the middle class and wage earners are really something that they have to focus on. And that's difficult for Washington to do. So the competitors that are being sort of described seem to be more willing than the optimists to take calculated risks, and they're much more comfortable tolerating friction with rivals such as China and Russia, but also with allies when they feel that allies need to step up and carry more of a burden, which is something that Trump really pushed. So the question is, for the incoming administration, can they get allies to step up, but do it in a much more collaborative, constructive way? So the competitors, I think, clearly see China as the greatest challenge, and they believe that they need to focus on that. And that means even if you have to then accept risk in the Middle East or Africa or anywhere else. And again, I think that's a pretty good way to link those foreign policy challenges with the pocketbook issues that drive most American voters. The optimists, on the other hand, are probably more likely to spread their attention around the world. And they're less likely to put pressure on allies to form coalitions against China. So even while that may be welcome, it presents its own challenges. So the competitors would probably be able to leverage some of the policy tools that were employed by the Trump administration. They would certainly suitably rebrand them, but they would apply some of the same techniques that Trump used to ensure US competitiveness. Now, I mean, the most important camp, of course, is Biden himself. And I think he's very much a centrist. He's going to be comfortable in either camp, and he's going to take his cues from his cabinet. But I think also importantly, he's going to take his cues from the Senate, where he's most comfortable and has deep, long relationships. And I think the Senate is clearly in a competitor frame of mind. So if the competitors gain Biden's ear, he has opportunities to prove pretty early on that things will be different this time around, and that he too recognizes that the world has changed since he was in office. But it's unclear how he's going to capitalize on them. I agree with Professor Rajagopalan that the importance of getting Taiwan policy and practice right is going to be a critical issue. And the US has considerable interest in its Taiwan relationship, which it really should pursue. It's important to remember that Taiwan is not a card that's played against China. It's the US's 10th largest trading partner. It's a global technology hub. It's geostrategically important as the anchor of the first island chain. So, I mean, Taiwan sits at the crossroads of the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So it's important to the US, but it's also important to Japan. So one opportunity for Biden to demonstrate that this is not Obama 2.0 is taking that congratulatory phone call from Tsai Ing-wen now that Xi Jinping has placed his call. So the precedent has already been set, and taking that phone call from President Tsai Ing-wen didn't prevent Trump from having multiple very productive summits with Xi Jinping after his inauguration. It didn't prevent China's cooperation to apply maximum pressure on North Korea. It didn't prevent China from continuing to support the Iran deal, even after Trump pulled out. So I think the downsides of China engagement from taking a call are probably going to be pretty minimal, and it won't preclude engagement with China down the road. So taking a phone call with China, with Tsai, in addition to having manageable risks with China, it demonstrates to US allies and partners that the US is willing to stand up and take the side of a key democratic partner, which reinforces the message that the US is not going to trade away its own or its allies' interests in some sort of grand bargain with China. So there are some very clear and immediate benefits from having that conversation with President Tsai. Not doing it before the inauguration probably sends the wrong signal. And really, the administration would get nothing from China in exchange other than some form of satisfaction from Beijing that this incoming administration is easily deterrable, which in Beijing speak is, someone that we can work with. So I think it's something that they really need to consider. The other issue, of course, is, Tony Blinken laid out his formula for China at a talk at the Hudson Institute earlier this summer. And he said, first, we need to invest in our own competitiveness. Second, we need to rally our allies and partners instead of alienating them to deal with those challenges that China presents. Third, he said, we need to stand up for our values and put them at the center of our foreign policy and not walk away from them. And then finally, he said that Biden administration will need to engage China and work with them in areas where the interests coincide. So Taiwan clearly ticks the allies and values boxes on that list. And it's going to be very difficult to skip that call and maintain credibility with our allies about standing up for values and our allies in the region. And I think that's the fundamental challenge of an alliance strategy for dealing with China that they're going to face. It's been made explicitly clear by our allies, as Raja alluded to, that they don't want to choose sides. So China, of course, is the master of economic coercion when small countries try to stand up to it. I mean, you look at South Korea after the THAAD decision, you look at Australia today, despite having an FTA with China, the recent signing of the RCEP, China's effectively embargoed Australian products. So that doesn't demonstrate support for multilateralism, the WTO, despite all of Xi Jinping's rhetoric as a supporter of the international system. So China's actions test the strength of any US alliance, and it effectively deters others from confronting China. And that's a real win-win for China. So the question is, how can the US confront that and make China think twice before they apply that kind of pressure on a US ally, and then figure out how it can rally the allies together. And I think the US-Japan alliance is probably going to be a critical factor. As Nabe points out, it is a very strong alliance. It has generally benefited from the Trump administration's forward-leaning approach in the region. And therefore, I think it is one that the incoming administration should focus on, primarily because I think Tokyo and Washington's interests are very closely aligned. I mean, neither country wants to completely divest or decouple from China. It's an important trading partner for every country on the planet. But that said, they do need to push back and in some cases actually use hard power to push back on China, because hard power is really the lingua franca of Asia. So I think the incoming officials in the Obama administration, they do recognize the shortcomings of the Obama approach. So the incoming officials in the Biden administration, they recognize the shortcomings of the Obama administration's approach. Jake Sullivan did an interview where he called, where he stated that going in with sort of this maximalist position based on principles and then finding themselves unprepared to back them up, he said that costs us. So the declaration on allies and values being at the heart of foreign policy is that sort of maximalist, principles-based approach that will come back to bite them if they take forceful action, if they don't take forceful action to back the allies. So I'll wrap this up because I'm coming up on 10 minutes here. But I think the administration's foreign policy is really going to be in trouble from the start if they do convince themselves not to surrender U.S. interests in order to pursue what are sometimes abstract notions of cooperation with China. I think it's really a false choice to suborn U.S. interests to China in the hope of some sort of cooperation is really false. China is willing to sell its COVID vaccines to the developing world, regardless of whether the U.S. pushes them to do it or not. If you look at China made its declaration to reach net zero on carbon in 2060 at the absolute nadir of U.S.-China relations. Beijing didn't need Washington's help to make those commitments. So I think the most important thing is that the Biden administration is going to have to demonstrate that they're willing to stand up to China and they're willing to apply hard power. They're going to need to signal very clearly in the national security documents that they have to produce within a few months of coming into office that they are not reluctant to emphasize their competition with China. And they need to call out China's bad behavior and not sort of give equal weight to competition and cooperation, because then I think the fears of Obama 2.0 become justified and there'll be consequences. And that'll be the real challenge with an alliance-based strategy towards addressing China. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Drew. Thanks for those insights. And I think everyone would agree with me. I think 3 excellent presentations, a stimulating start for this morning's session. Now, there are a couple of questions on the chat box. I want all our viewers and listeners, please send in your questions. We'll collect them and post them to the speakers. So keep them rolling in, the questions. But meanwhile, I just wanted to ask a couple of opening questions so that the panel can discuss some issues, and then we'll go back to the questions that are there. One is, there is this great celebration in Asia, in the mainstream media, in Washington, that the competence is back. That is now, compared to the chaos of the last 4 years, we now have competence. Not only that, since the competent people are also familiar to most of us. So there is this sense of great comfort that competence is going to be back. But thinking of the Chinese have a nice phrase, it is the Maoist time, red versus expert. That is, do you depend on experts to solve social problems, or is there a political perspective? Of course, in the Chinese case, it comes from the Communist Party. But in the US case, when you are at a cusp of change, is relying on conventional wisdom, expertise as constituted, is that the most important thing for the United States and for the outsiders who deal with the United States? Or a political leadership that is willing to take a more longer-term political look and adapt policies to deal with changed internal positions and external conditions? So, Drew, you can start, and I'll just go and ask the other 2 speakers as well.
Sure, thank you, Raja. That's a very deep philosophical question, and maybe I'll focus on the U.S. as opposed to the foreign policy piece, because they're interrelated. I mean, as I kind of mentioned during my remarks, I mean, we are undergoing a period of great change, and actually, if you follow Chinese foreign policy speeches and writing, Xi Jinping repeats often this notion that we're going through profound changes unseen in a century, and that's a function of their analysis of really how the world is changing, the rise of populism, the shifting wealth between Europe and the U.S., the West and the East, to put it crudely, the rise of China's elimination of poverty and the general improvement in social and economic conditions there. I think all of that, from a Chinese perspective, has created great changes that create opportunities for China, and they are approaching that as pragmatically as they can. But that's part and parcel and very core to their own ideology in the Communist Party. The U.S., of course, is so much more diverse, and you don't have that Marxist process of analyzing in great detail what the society's conditions are and the nature of relationships within society and between countries. So the US tends to live in the moment and deal with the problems as they come and deal with them very fluidly, but following, of course, the US principles and values. So the US is going to struggle in some ways to deal with these tremendous domestic divisions that, as Nabe points out, Trump exacerbated and Biden seeks to close. And I think if they can get that right and focus that time, then just as that Marxist approach to categorizing societal stresses, right? Societal relationships between the laboring classes and capital. If you can get that in a better position in the US and create more stability for the middle class and get wages to rise again and manage the labor markets better and productivity increases that don't negatively impact employment, then I think the US relationship with other countries and trade policy will fall into a much better place.
Thank you. Watanabe-san, I mean, you like Ivy League competence, or do you want someone who's willing to look beyond the experts to bring a political perspective to US challenges today, particularly in dealing with Indo-Pacific Asia?
Okay. It's a very, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. It's a very, of course, the philosophical question, a very difficult question because of domestic politics, and also that's a societal and sometimes economic discrepancy, many things. But that's not a new thing for Japanese to see. If you remember the Japan, United States trade conflict era, already that happened. I think many Japanese laborers are suffering from a job is exporting outside from United States, and trade deficit with Japan is very tough. At the time, bipartisan agreement for the bashing Japan bashing, and Japan really forced to change Japan's domestic production, or of course trade battle happened. And at that time, many people don't care about the US-Japan alliance. So Japan tried to persuade the US and also reminding a US leader what is the most important for the US interest. Yeah. And luckily, Japan succeeded. And this time, I'm not sure how China is try to change herself or try to persuade the US. But anyway, US, the domestic issue is a very strong driving force, and Japan cannot change, China cannot change. By the way, the same thing applies to China too. We cannot change domestic trouble in China. So we just need to prepare and but try to make it better and working.
Thank you. Raji, maybe before we go to the audience questions, look, India knows that, actually, the relationship improved because Bush overruled the nuclear non-proliferation experts to say we must deal with India differently, break from the convention to open up a path which has really translated into something very productive. Similarly, Trump, defied the US conventional wisdom on China and has unleashed a policy which, as most of you said, will be quite hard for Biden to abandon completely. So how do you see the mix? Does India, you mentioned India knows all these guys who are coming into the Biden administration, but does India have enough reach with the Democratic Party, the political class, Biden in particular, so that they can balance out the relationship effectively?
No, I think absolutely no. It's a tough question whether India has invested enough, and I think you yourself have written about this and how invested are we. And I think that's where and to link it to the question that you asked earlier, expertise or the political sort of a sense of dealing with the problems and the challenges in the region. And I think Trump showed that despite the problems in handling the US allies and so on and so forth, I think he handled India and China pretty well. And I think we did have a solid relationship despite the he was seen as a very transactional president, but at the same time, the way he approached India was significantly different. If he went along a very transactional approach, I think we would have hit the wall, so to say. But I think the China factor kept China factor out. Of course, the COVID-19 situation kept the focus on China very, very clear. And we saw significant moments of improvement in the relationship overall. But I think the Biden administration is going to be challenging in many ways, because I think if you're going to have a value-based and democracy emphasis and so on and so forth, I think given some of the recent developments within India in the Indian domestic context, I think we are going to run into problem. And I'm not entirely certain that we have invested enough at this point of time with the Biden administration possible nominees who might come into office. And so I think there are going to be hiccups, but I think given the China problem that is looming pretty large, we will find ways to sort of accommodate each other's concerns and so on and so forth. So China and COVID will likely sort of take the US-India relationship forward without too many glitches, I would say. But I think there are going to be some hiccups here and there.
So there was one basic question from the audience. Maybe Drew can answer this, and Watanabe-san perhaps. The question is, look, there was this phone call between Trump and, Biden and Suga-san, where Biden seems to have used the word Indo-Pacific, but added the words instead of free and open, secure and prosperous. So how serious is there some, does thought go into these kind of things? So do we make something out of it? Drew, you can go first.
Sure, Raja. I mean, I think it's a little bit much to read too much into these readouts at this point. I mean, Biden does have a core staff of very talented people around him. Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan. He's got Jeff Prescott and Eli Ratner, who cover Asia. Very much involved. So I mean, they know how to write his talking points. But remember, the transition has been quite complex. It's been suboptimal. They only got the resources and the certification from the General Services Agency, yesterday, day before. So they haven't really had the full support of the career civil servants and the bureaucracy to help them sort of hit the ground running in mid-January. So you got to give them a little more time to craft formulations. I think how it appears in the national security strategy is really going to matter. I think how it appears in these initial readouts, they're still trying to find their feet, and I think it's too soon to really hold them accountable.
Okay, thanks. Then I'll go now. We're getting a lot more questions. There are two related questions on China. One is what is the debate in China of how it is looking at the Biden administration? 2 days ago, there was an op-ed by Madame Fu Ying in New York Times, and New York Times also explained why they published this article. It's a play. I mean, I think Fu Ying is very good in her articulation, basically telling the Americans we can work together. You want to compete and cooperate? Yeah, we're ready for compete and cooperate. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice. I mean, this was expected that the Chinese would make a play for the kind of Biden administration. They won't waste time. So this is really quite quick. That's one question. The other question is, maybe Raji can deal with it, which is, the question is that, look, so is the region now prepared to, look at outside powers to balance China? Has it become, totally necessary to go outside? Because the Chinese also play on the slogan Asia for Asians when they want to weaken American alliances. Given the American alliances have been here since the end of the Second World War, for many, they saw it as central to dealing with the Soviet Union. But when it comes to China, it's become more muddier, of course. So both these questions: how is China reading the change of regime in Washington, if you will, and countries like Japan and Australia have been relied on American alliances, but is India now moving in the same direction? Are more countries going to do it? So Drew, we'll start with you, then I'll go to Raji.
Sure. I mean, all right, Fu Ying's article in the Times was obviously very short. It's worth noting that the editor of the opinion page also, or the editorial, the opinion page also had to write her own article justifying adding it. So it wasn't without controversy. I mean, she puts a number of areas for cooperation, but again, very vague and unclear what the benefits of that cooperation would be. I mean, she mentions climate change as a potential area, but I mean, again, what does that mean? I mean, China's built tremendous overcapacity in solar panels. They've put a lot of other companies around the world out of business making solar panels. So, is China's contribution going to be giving away solar panels to the rest of the world? I mean, is that cooperation? Or is simply not interfering in the process? I mean, remember in 2009, He Yafei and Xie Jianhua effectively disrupted the Copenhagen Peace Conference or the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference in 2009. So, I mean, is that Chinese cooperation is not undermining international systems? So she also proposes things like people-to-people ties, which I think is pretty unrealistic, especially in the era of Xi Jinping. There really is no more sort of free will of the Chinese people. Xi Jinping's objectives are really clear. I mean, he really seeks to reassert the Communist Party's power throughout all aspects of Chinese society and the economy. So from that perspective, you're dealing with essentially a very, very centralized state, trying to influence and conducting foreign influence operations with the US. So these are not terribly practical areas for cooperation. But I think, again, I don't think that the Biden administration changes Xi Jinping's approach towards China's own domestic policies. I mean, remember, China still sees a large portion of its own population as a threat, an internal threat, which is why the crackdown on civil society and the pervasive censorship and surveillance still exists. So they're dealing with both internal and external threats that really shape their worldview. The other thing to think about is that China's already locked in its policies and strategies going forward. They just signed off at the most recent party plenum, the 5th five-year plan, which will run out to 2025. They've also established an industrial policy that will run until 2035. So the possibility of China changing course just because there's a new US administration is virtually nil. So the real question for the Biden administration is, do they want to accommodate China on the path that they've chosen and essentially shape US approaches accordingly? Or is the US going to compete and press China to make changes? So that's the fundamental question.
Thanks. Raji, India traditionally strategic autonomy, non-alliance, but as China's power has grown, it is now, gotten closer to the US as never before. It used to talk about multipolar world, but now it's talking about a multipolar Asia, because the problem is, look, when you have a strong power on your neighborhood and it's threatening you, that's when you balance, right? So it's not regional or extra-regional, but it is normally your neighbors who threaten you, which is kind of a part of history. So is India's policy evolving to one of actually of working with the US, a distant power, to balance the next door giant?
Absolutely, and I'll also link it to that question about China. Is the region willing to wanting to extra regional power in a sense? And I think that's clearly seen in India's own behavior in a sense. We want, and it's not China's sustained progress which is the problem. It is China's economic power which has made it possible for a significant military power to reckon with in a sense. And that, along with its bullying behavior, especially since the beginning of 2020, has been seriously problematic. So even those countries, whether it is in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, who has been at the receiving end of the aggressive behavior, harassing behavior of China on the maritime spaces at Natuna Seas, or Vietnam, or even India. Now we have been on a 6-month plus sort of a standoff conflict mode with China in the Himalayas. So in a sense, each of these countries are now beginning to see that we need the US power. We need to align closer with the US. There are some uncertainties with the US about the US commitment to the region, and I think that's why the region is also kind of coming up with its own minilaterals. Any number of trilaterals are coming up, and they are becoming stronger by the day, precisely because we just finished the India's trilateral exercise with Singapore and Thailand. Just finished a few days ago. This is the second edition that just happened. In a sense, it also shows that even countries in Southeast Asia are now becoming more comfortable playing with, they do see an important role for India in managing the security dynamics in the region. So I think the Chinese military aggressive power, trade and economic coercion against countries that do not fall in line with China have been sort of pushing these countries to take a clearer stand, a closer embrace of the US. The US power and leadership is absolutely critical, because even if you put put all the major Indo-Pacific powers together, it doesn't match China's power in a sense. And therefore, you need the US. But in the case of a US lack of commitment or unwillingness, you also have other regional partnerships that are coming up as a sort of hedge against that.
Thank you. Watanabe-san, alliance with the US is central to Japan's post-war foreign policy. And it has worked hard to manage the sustained alliance under Trump. But today, in fact, the rising and assertive China has made alliances even more important for Japan. But at the same time, the US debate domestically makes it, raises questions about sustainability of alliances in the face of a rising regional hegemon. So the tension between in the US between does it engage China, compromise, work out some kind of an arrangement with them, which the allies will see as at their expense. While if you confront the Chinese too hard with your allies, you have. So how does Japan see this problem for itself? Can you still think you can work the alliance without a crisis, new crisis?
I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think, the Prime Minister Suga administration's solution approach is a kind of solution for the very difficult contradicting portion of with the US and with China, as you explained. First of all, I think Suga invited the Quad meeting, Quad foreign ministerial meeting in October. That's the Secretary of State Pompeo and your Indian foreign minister and Australian foreign minister and the Quad foreign one. At that time, China is offering to visit of foreign minister Wang Yi to Japan, and Japan clearly showed the Pompeo first and Wang Yi later, and very recent visit of Chinese Prime Minister Wang Yi was a very failure of diplomacy. It was a good chance for the China to attract Japan. However, the Wang Yi's offer for the Senkaku was really absurd. Like just stop sending fishermen boat to the area surrounding Senkaku. That Senkaku is controlled by Japan, and also I think it was effective to the Biden-Suga talk, telephone talk. I think clearly the Suga Biden clearly showed the view, confirms the view that Senkaku is a target of a U.S.-Japan security treaty. I think it's clearly contrasting to the Chinese approach to the U.S. approach. At least China's approach is very much not wise, not diplomatic. U.S. case is even the domestic audience is kind of very tough on too much of the political capital, too much capital spent to the outside of the United States. However, U.S. leadership is very understandable. So Japan's clearly continue to work very difficult situation. Still, the security on the U.S. and economy on China. However, shifting more needed more room for our own independent thinking. So, who is important? That's India, Australia, ASEAN. That's Japan's Indo-Pacific. That's a little bit different from US Indo-Pacific. So Japan continued to have this kind of idea and trying to cooperate. However, very important prerequisite is the United States, alliance with the United States. Japan really needed to secure the US presence in the Indo-Pacific region. That's first step. In that case, it's very difficult for the China to try to change this kind of a policy.
Thank you. Thank you. There are a question, interesting, important question on trade and economics. I mean, here, there are two sets of issues, maybe all three of you can respond. One, in the US, Biden is saying, look, no more free trade treaties without taking into account the interests of the working people. It's not just globalization like old globalization, but it must work for the Americans. Now, while there are strong groups in the US, the Wall Street, Silicon Valley want to go back to business as usual, there is the political pressure not to simply go back to the old state. So how is the trade policy of the Biden administration going to evolve? And I think this is going to be a big arena of contestation, and not just from Trump and Trumpism, but also from the progressives who see, the trade and globalism, undermining American middle class and its interests. So therefore, there's one is the internal dynamic. I mean, how the U.S. is going to deal with, trade issues, and second, on the outside, the Japanese talked about, a new, TPP without the Americans. Now, do they expect? Did there any sense of what they would like to see U.S. going to do on that issue? And in the Indian case, we know that, look, India has had problems on trade with every administration and with everybody in the world. So that's not shocking. That for now, but India was also engaged with the Trump administration on Quad Plus, realigning security, value chains, working with Australia, Japan to redo the, at least regional resilience arrangements, and also reaching out to Taiwan, to Apple, to say, look, to draw some investment away. So maybe all three of you can quickly tell the different dimensions of how trade is going to play out under Biden. Drew, you want to start first?
Sure, Raja, thanks. And I appreciate the background there to give me time to think. Yeah, this is really going to be one of those defining challenges for the administration. So, I mean, my sense is there really isn't much support within the Democratic Party, within Congress, within the Senate to join RCEP or CPTPP, TPP. I think that's probably a bridge too far. I think the U.S. terms now to go into it would require a great deal of a lot of clauses added on things like human rights, labor, and that's probably a poison pill. So I think the bigger issue would be, and the bigger trend is really, how do you work with industry and these global companies, many of which are American and Japanese, and Taiwanese, how do you work with them to diversify their supply chain so you don't have over dependence on China? And I think that's going to be where the administration can probably create a series of incentives. That's where the levers of government come into play. And remember, the US government doesn't interfere in markets very much, but the role of things like the Foreign Commercial Service can play a big role. So rather than focusing, as the Trump administration did, on simply promoting US exports at the expense of everything else, they can really work on helping US companies establish manufacturing facilities in places like Vietnam, Southeast Asia. So not so much in a divest completely or decouple from China, which I think is going to be a very difficult task, but really sort of help companies pursue that China plus one strategy so that they can be effective global players and not just dependent on China.
Yeah, Watanabe-san, I mean, where do you see trade policy?
Oh yeah, of course. The Japan experienced the kind of a management of a trade relation with the United States during the 80s and the early 90s. In the name of a free trade. However, we tackled on managed trade, kind of the protectionist approach, because U.S. people are actually so frustrated with trade deficits. Same thing is now applying to the U.S. relation with China. So Japan understands. And again, we don't know how China would understand this. However, Japan work hard to maintain the framework of free trade overall. I think CPTPP or Japan, EU, EPA. So now Japan signed RCEP too, even without India, unfortunately. So that's kind of a message to the both United States and China. Hey, we really need the framework of a free trade. That's good for the engine of economic growth. However, to maintain this, sometimes we need to do some unfree trade practice. It's a paradoxical, but a very important experience of Japan with the United States. So Japan would like to promote this kind of a subtle management. And again, to attain this, Japan really needed the cooperation with India and Australia and other ASEAN country and Europe too. So free trade, there's no free trade, pure according to the model. It's only the mind of the the intellectuals. But no, we can manage, however, free trade framework in the world in order to survive in our own economy.
Raji, I mean, you see India, people see that India is moving too much of an inward orientation, but is there room with Quad Plus and other initiatives to do bilateral trade agreements with the US and others?
I think, yeah, the trade, sort of a trade and investment agreement with the US has been in the works for some time, but I'm told that we are getting closer and closer to some sort of a limited deal with the US in a sense, so that might happen. But I think there are also, I think India is also showing ways to kind of engage more on a bilateral framework. Recently talked to the establishment, you get the sense that there has been this whole inward looking, but I think that's driven by the Make in India kind of a sort of a policy initiative that needs to be given some chance. Maybe we have moved only from number 1 to 3 or 4 and we haven't reached 10 yet, but I think the feeling is that you need to give that a bit of a chance before you kind of go into arrangements such as RCEP, which did not really cater to India's sort of issues out there. But I think India is also looking to engage through sort of groupings like the Quad Plus. It's coming the COVID context, and it's primarily looking at the economic recovery, the vaccine development, and a whole range of things. But I think it could also emerge as something more strategic in nature in the post-COVID scenario. Because if you look at initially how the Quad came about, it came in the context of the 2005 tsunami, post-tsunami recovery. It did take a different shape. So I think you do have sort of initiatives such as whether it's the India, Australia, Japan supply chain resilience initiative or the Quad Plus, all of these gaining some more strategic sort of an angle in the sort of a post-COVID world in a sense. Because I think there are really sense that too much of dependence on one country is problematic. So even economic decisions are being taken with a strategic input. And I think that's the way we got to, because China is effectively using economic tools to further their national interests in a sense.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions for Drew. Drew, I mean, I think one is a general question about, look, there's so much noise from the US, thousands of outlets, everybody's holding forth on what on policy, multiplicity of think tanks. So the noise. So given that, one of the questions is, how do you make sense out of this seeming Tower of Babel that Washington is? In that, where do you see actually policy moving? And I'm just reading something from Shapiro, Jeremy Shapiro, saying that, look, think tanks pretend to influence and the administrations pretend to read them. So there is a whole make-believe out there. So how do you judge the outcomes? And that's one part. The second is, you talked about hard power. There is this talk about Michelle Flournoy and Watanabe and also referred to. But quite clearly, the so-called progressives have blocked her nomination, at least for now, I mean, announcing her nomination. So, what is their complaint and how strong are the progressives? I mean, how much of flesh that are they demanding from Biden, and how much is he willing to give to deal with the guys who actually made him win the election? But you know how in most of these cases, if you're strong enough, you discard your old friends.
Thanks, Raja. Those are good questions. I mean, the Washington policy environment is is complicated. It's noisy, but it's there to allow all of those views to get put out there, and it's not really designed to shape public opinion, though that can be a derivative. It's really to be a resource for policymakers. In some cases, it's policymakers when they're not in government, getting their thoughts gathered, getting their strategies clear, getting their ideologies refined, and then going back into government with that opportunity. So it's not so much intended to be like, what's the answer? It's intended to be really sort of a broader based approach. And don't forget the other thing that the think tank community in Washington does, and it does very well out here as well, is it also helps interpret those regional perspectives. So that you kind of have a one-stop shop in the big think tanks and the specialty think tanks for issue sets. So that becomes a resource as well. So it's not intended to provide the answer. It's provided to create some action from ideas. The other thing that you mentioned, I mean, Michelle Flournoy, I mean, I worked for her in the Department of Defense. Actually, I worked for her also, or with her at CSIS many years ago, as did Nabe. I mean, I think anyone who's had any contact with her recognizes what a really good person she is. I mean, how good she is to the people around her, how insightful she is, how strategic. I mean, she's got all the skills and would be a great secretary. Obviously, there's internal tensions between different factions of the Democratic Party. Remember, there's constitutionally, intentionally created tensions between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So I think that's part and parcel. I mean, I wouldn't count her out. Remember, the average tenure of a political appointee in Washington is 18 months. So you tend to have multiple secretaries in any administration. And this period might be very contentious, but I think she'd make a great secretary at any period. And she does have the experience of dealing with, and I think one of the things her detractors have said is that she's too close to the business community. And while that's true or not, it's important that the administration understands the needs of key constituents. It's not just voters in a congressional district. It's also the business community that needs the ear of policymakers so that they can thrive in a very globalized world.
Yeah, so then there is a question that I want to ask all three of you, which is about China's growing ability to drive a wedge within the US alliances and between different parts of US and Asia. For example, China talks about, we should not have alliances in Asia. Alliances are bad. Alliances are so 19th century. Let's have collective security, of course, led by the Chinese. Then they say Asia for Asians. Then they say, if Quad is, why is it exclusive? Why not? I'm not there in it. They say BRI is the way to globalize while Americans are turning protectionist. So, and this plays out with each country in a different way. But there we are. I mean, maybe we can start with Raja this time. That whenever we do something, the Chinese, we've gone to an extent where they say that, if only India were not getting close to the Americans, they would be quite happy to give India solutions. But it's also a fact when they were close to the Americans, that seemed all right, but they don't want India to be close to the. So how do they use the device to divide? How is that playing out in India? The attempt to prevent India from going too close to the US?
That's a great question to kind of sum up the whole lot of issues that we are confronting, we are dealing with in a sense. And I think the problem is rhetoric and actions. There's a huge gap between what China says and what it does on the ground in a sense. So on the one hand, it talks about how peaceful rise, communities of shared destiny and so on and so forth. But I think that if you ask any of China's neighbors, or even today, now even countries far away from the immediate neighborhood, do have a very different story to tell about China, how they feel about China. And having said that, I think China's behavior and China's own view about Asia and the global, China looks at the Asia in a very hegemonical fashion in a sense. It does look at states in a hegemonic fashion, does have a hierarchy of states that are powerful, states that are big, and it classifies states as small and so on and so forth. So it does look at the Asian region, but also globally, the whole view is very hierarchy driven in a sense. So I think even though it does take issues to the US talking about the US alliance system and so on and so forth, it has its own conception of how it does classify states into big states and small states, and how small states should not take sides and so on and so forth. So it does try to impose its own kind of views. That's one set of issues. Second, of course, when it comes to the US-India relations, and I think China has been trying to make this point repeatedly, that it is India's growing closer relations with the US that is coming as a problem, and that's also used as some sort of a rationale as to why within the Indian if you look at the strategic community, and how they try to justify many of our problems with China is today because India has grown closer to the US. That really doesn't sit well, because if you look at US-India relations have come close only in the last decade and a half, 2 decades. But China problem with China has been a much longer one. In fact, from the late 50s onwards, we have been having problems. Maybe it has become a much more today because post deal and so on and so forth. But if you look at China's balancing efforts at India, I think this is a long, several decades old. So I think it's a very lazy argument to make that it is a growing closer relationship between the US and India that is at the crux of the problems with China in a sense.
Lazy might be, but clever way of neutralizing your neighbors, right? So, Watanabe-san, anything on your side, and how the divisions of Asia, how Japan hopes to overcome that?
Yeah, thank you. I already told the China's action, the approach toward the Asian neighbors, including many important allied partner or strategic partner of the United States, was not so effective and strategic. And but at the same time, Trump administration's approach to the Asian country was not so strategic and effective. So it's the good chance of opportunity for the change of the United States government, especially the Biden administration is really trying to show at least the president is attending a major Asian related conference. That's very important. Of course, Japan was exceptional. Fortunately for Japan, Japan enjoyed a close communication with President Trump. However, the Asian neighbor missed the U.S. president presence, especially in a very major conference, and also a positive attitude of the U.S. president. So I think that's really, we expect Biden to change. Somehow the Biden is the first approach is to try to repair the relation with the transatlantic relation, maybe with the European. But at the same time, I really Biden to attend a major Asian conference from now on. That's my expectation.
Okay. Yeah, Drew. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to look at this is not just the US-China dynamic and how that plays out for other countries. I mean, one way to look at it is what do those other countries want? I mean, they have agency, as we say. So I mean, I guess the question to maybe ask is, what does the region want to see from the US? And in the case of Southeast Asia, kind of my tick list is, the sort of the ASEAN countries want to see predictability and political presence. They want the US to show up, as Nabe just said. They want the US to embrace ASEAN centrality and to recognize the value, the intrinsic value that ASEAN brings. They want the US to also rebalance its portfolio in the region, to not just be the dominant provider of security, but also to have a much greater economic presence. I mean, the US is a major foreign direct investor in many ASEAN countries. And I think lastly, they do want the administration to not only apply hard power where it's appropriate in things like freedom of navigation operations, but to also manage those tensions with China, which I would give both Obama and Trump administrations pretty high marks for doing. So the rhetoric has been bad, but if you look at the actual strategic stability between the US and China, it's been pretty stable. So, I mean, the bottom line is the incoming administration is going to see a region that's really in full hedging mode. And the question is, how do they reassure those partners and allies in the region that collaborating with the US is not a trap? It's not they're not being entrapped in some sort of coalition against China, but definitely going to have to stand up and take on greater burdens to shape China so that it becomes a supporter of those international norms and rules that everyone has benefited from.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Watanabe-san. Thank you, Raji. I mean, before I hand over to Chano-san, who's going to give us some closing remarks, just three thoughts. And one, I think the US is at a turning point. Internally, its politics, the nature of its internal coalitions is changing. So those of us who look at it purely from foreign policy must recognize and look in no major power foreign policy can be separated from domestic politics and domestic economy. And I think those debates are big debates in the United States. So we must pay a lot more attention to them. Second, I think while we see a seemingly restored Obama, you can call it Obama 3.0, but the pressures, I think, in terms of how to frame its international relations, whether it's on globalization, trade, Asia, Europe, they're all, I think, open for debate. And that's why what Drew was saying, that look, we need to pay closer attention to US debates and not view it. Most of us tend to view the US from our own bilateral relations perspective. But I think time has come to think of the US as a process, and that the larger dynamic that is unfolding within the United States. And then I think there is some expectation that the Indo-Pacific as a framing will continue, but the nuances of that policy are going to be there with us. And that's where we hope we're going to work with Sasakawa Foundation, ISAS and Sasakawa Foundation. Hopefully this partnership we can build and bring deeper insights as we begin to approach a new administration in the next few weeks. And in the new year, hopefully we'll come back to you with an additional set of debates on where the region is going. Chano-san, I'll hand it over to you, and you have the last word. And
Okay, thank you, Professor Mohan. And hello, everyone. It really gives me great pleasure to make a few remarks in concluding this wonderful event. And first of all, I'd like to thank all the participants for your time and interest in today's dialogue. And I also would like to congratulate the three speakers on your splendid and stimulating discussions that I enjoyed very much, together with thoughtful moderation by Professor Raja Mohan. And of course, special thanks go to Professor Raja Mohan and the Institute of South Asian Studies of National University of Singapore. We at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation have been thrilled to work together with a like-minded institution like yours and to develop and co-organize this seminar that is really on a timely topic that many of us are contemplating these days. The Sasakawa Peace Foundation has been committed to fostering peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. And I truly believe that the collaboration like this one is key to move forward with our shared vision. So this is the very first event of ours, but certainly not the last. So thank you very much and hope to see you soon again. Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Take